G'day, welcome to the Digger History Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Robinson. The 1st of March 1901 is the birthday of the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Navy. This puts them in 2025 as 124 years old. Quite young in terms of defence forces around the world, but in terms of countries around the world, Australia is quite a young country. The formation of the Australian Army and Navy stems back to Federation in 1901. On the 1st of January 1901, the colonies of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, West Australia and Tasmania formed the Commonwealth of Australia. Prior to Federation, each colony had its own separate defence force. Under the new constitution, the federal government was to take charge of defence, which means the colonies, which were to become states, were to disband their defence forces and hand them over to the control of the federal government. And this handover took place on the 1st of March 1901. For some reason, which I haven't been able to find through research why, it took a full 2 months after Federation for the states to hand over the defence forces to the federal government. But anyway, it happened 2 months later, and the federal government took charge of the armies of 6 separate colonies and the navies of 5 separate colonies. So why only 5 navies? Well, the answer to that is West Australia did not actually possess a navy. So 1901, the new Australian federal government took charge of the the Commonwealth military forces, which consisted of the Army and Navy, and notably no Air Force at that time. Air Forces weren't really a thing in 1901. That was to come about 20 years later in 1921, when the Royal Australian Air Force, which is actually one of the oldest air forces in the world, came into being. But that's the story for another podcast. We'll just concentrate on the Army and the Navy at this stage. So, so the armies of the six colonies or states, as now they can, even though they were now Australian soldiers, they still had a quite a state identity, which still is depicted these days in the reserve units. So the reserve infantry battalions of each state have bear the name of that state. So you have the Royal New South Wales Regiment, Royal Victoria Regiment, Royal Queensland Regiment, Royal Tasmanian Regiment, the Royal South Australian Regiment, and the Royal West Australian Regiment. The only notable exception to that rule is the reserve forces, infantry forces in Northern Territory, which are called Norforce. And then the regular infantry units of the Australian Army take on the Royal Australian Regiment title. So that's the Army sorted. So what about the Navy? So as I mentioned previously, there were only 5 colonies that actually had a navy. Western Australia didn't have its own navy, but the colonies that did have a navy, they weren't the greatest navy. They were kind of dilapidated ships. They were classes they called what we class as green water fleet, which means they can't really go much outside the territorial waters of the country. So the Royal Navy actually still stationed a fleet in Australia, and that was paid for by Australia and New Zealand. They had to pay the British an upkeep of for them to have their fleet in Australia. So essentially, Australia was paying for 2 navies. And there was a lot of debate about whether we should get a better navy of our own or continue to finance the Royal Navy's presence in the Southern Hemisphere. This debate kicked on until 1909 when it was finally decided that Australia needed its own navy. And the process was started to order a new fleet, ocean-going fleet. And then on the 10th of July 1911, the Royal Australian Navy was given this name, Royal Australian Navy. And there it is. That's the birthday of the Australian Army and the Australian Navy. And that could have well been the end of this podcast had I not found an interesting anomaly that I thought I would mention in this podcast. So while doing research, I I noted that, like the Australian Army, the Australian Navy will be celebrating its 124th birthday in 2025, which, if you do the maths, take 124th from 2025, you get 1901, which is obviously the birthday of the Australian Navy. So I looked into a bit more. I did a bit more research. I found this old movie tone, one of those old documentary kind of movie tone things in the black and white with the dude that kind of has the really spruiking voice, um that the documentary type, old 50s and 60s voice. So this is in 1961, and there was a documentary on the 50th birthday of the Royal Australian Navy. So in 1961, the Navy was celebrating its 50th birthday. So if you do the maths then, 1961 take 50 comes to 1911. So I said to myself, that's pretty interesting, because somewhere along the line, the Navy has aged 10 years. It's got 10 years older. So I looked up the 75th anniversary of the Royal Australian Navy, and there was a documentary in that the Navy celebrated the 75th anniversary in 1986, which, if you do the maths, still puts that date as 1911. So somewhere along the line, somewhere between 1986 and 2021, I saw there was a documentary in 2021 of the Navy celebrating 120 years. So 2021, the Navy recognised its birthday as 1901, but in in 1986, the Navy was recognising it as 1911. So I guess if you think about the Royal Australian Navy, you actually being presented with that title, given the Royal Australian Navy title, that date was the 10th of July 1911, but we did have a Navy prior to that, 10 years prior to that, on the 1st of March. So somewhere in the years between 1986 and 2021, someone's made the decision to change the year, change the date that the Navy recognises its birthday. And in my research, I couldn't actually find any information about when this happened, why this happened, who made this decision. So if there's any Navy people out there that can shed some light on this, feel free to drop a comment and let us know. It's quite interesting. The Navy aged 10 years. I mean, I guess if someone discovered that I was 10 years older than what I really am, I probably wouldn't be too happy, but I guess the Navy's a bit more excited about it than I would be if I was 10 years older than I thought I was. So there it is, a quick history of the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Navy's birthday. And just one more point. So the date, the 1st of the 3rd, 1901, that's actually in the hotline for ADF careers. So if you're calling the Defence Force to look at a career in the Australian Defence Force, the phone number you would call is 13 1901, the 1st of the 3rd, 1901. So that's all I've got for you today, a quick history on the anniversary of the Army and Navy. If you've got any ideas or suggestions on what I could do future podcasts on, please feel free to pop in the comments. Like, subscribe, tell your friends. Thank you for listening. Talk to you next time.